Laughter rolled through the private banquet hall of Hollowell Memorial Hospital, sharp and bright, the kind of laughter that only comes from people who have never once doubted their place in the world. Vivian Sterling stood at the center of it. A woman built for rooms like this one, her silk blazer catching the light of the chandeliers overhead. In her hand, she held a single bill, crisp and green, folded once between two manicured fingers. She reached forward and tucked it into the front pocket of a gray uniform shirt, the fabric worn soft from years of washing. "Go mop," she said, loud enough for every one of her 17 relatives to hear. "That is what people like you get paid for." The man she spoke to did not flinch. He lowered his eyes, murmured a quiet thank you, and returned to the mop leaning against the wall behind him. 20 minutes later, every phone in that hall would buzz at once, and the laughter would die in every throat that had made it. But for now, none of them knew what was coming. For now, there was only wine, crystal glasses, and a man in a gray uniform they had already decided did not deserve their attention. The chandeliers threw soft gold light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and somewhere beneath that shine, quietly, invisibly, the entire future of the building was about to change hands. Damon Ashford had arrived before sunrise, long before the caterers, long before the string quartet tuned their instruments in the corner of the room. He moved through the VIP wing of the hospital with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this work for years, wiping down marble counters, straightening chairs, checking that every surface gleamed for the 40th anniversary celebration. He was 41 years old, a widower, though nobody in that hospital knew the weight he carried home each night to an empty house. He spoke rarely. He watched everything. His eyes moved across a room the way a man reads a ledger, cataloging details others missed entirely. The tension between a husband and wife near the bar, the nervous glance of a junior accountant toward the door, the exact moment a family decided a stranger was beneath their notice. By 9 in the morning, the hall had filled with the extended Hollowell family. 17 relatives gathered to celebrate the anniversary of the hospital. Their patriarch had built 4 decades earlier from little more than a single struggling clinic on the edge of downtown. They were minor shareholders, all of them, holding small slices of a company that had grown into one of the most respected private hospitals in the city, a name spoken with pride at dinner parties and charity galas alike. Grant Hollowell, 67 years old and still sharp-eyed despite his age, stood near the head table accepting handshakes and congratulations. His voice warm, his laughter easy, a man who had spent his life believing hard work and good intentions were enough to guarantee a decent legacy. His wife Marjorie moved beside him, elegant in pearls, nodding at every compliment paid to her husband's achievement. Their daughter Vivian, 39 and already the hospital's chief executive, commanded the room, the way she commanded every room she entered, her heels clicking against marble with the rhythm of someone who had never once questioned her own authority. To this family, Damon was furniture. He was the man who emptied trash bins and polished floors, a presence so beneath their notice that they spoke freely in front of him, laughed loudly around him, and occasionally, when it amused them, aimed a comment his way simply because they could. Trevor Hollowell, Vivian's cousin, 44 years old, and perpetually eager to prove his place among the family's inner circle, deliberately tipped his wineglass so that a dark red stain spread across the polished floor near the dessert table. He did not apologize. He simply looked toward Damon and said, "That needs cleaning," in the tone one might use for a dog that had wandered too close to the food. Damon knelt without a word and wiped the stain away, his movements calm, unhurried, betraying nothing. Vivian watched him from across the room, a small, satisfied smile curling at the corner of her mouth. She crossed the space between them with the confidence of a woman who had never been told no in a room she owned. "How long?" she asked, tilting her head. "Would it take someone like you to afford a car in that parking lot outside?" The question landed exactly as she intended. Laughter rippled through the gathered relatives, Celeste covering her mouth with a manicured hand, an uncle raising his glass as if a toast had just been given, someone near the back, muttering that this was better entertainment than the string quartet. Damon looked up at her, and for a moment, something flickered behind his calm expression. something none of them recognized, because none of them had ever bothered to truly look at him. He said nothing. He simply smiled, the kind of smile that gives away nothing, and returned to his work, wringing out the cloth, folding it neatly, setting it aside. Vivian turned back to her family with the air of someone who had won a contest no one else knew was being played. She did not see the way Damon's jaw tightened as he walked away. She did not notice him glance once, briefly, at the slim watch on his wrist, a gesture so small it would have meant nothing to anyone who did not already know what it counted down to. She had already decided, in that unspoken way cruel people plan their cruelty, that she was not finished with him yet. Before the afternoon ended, she intended to make sure the entire family remembered exactly what a man like Damon Ashford was worth. She leaned toward her mother and whispered something that made Marjorie laugh behind her handkerchief. And across the room, Grant, still shaking hands, still smiling for photographs, remained entirely unaware of what his daughter was preparing to do in his own hospital. At his own celebration, in front of everyone who mattered to their family name. The moment came an hour later, when the toasts had finished and the champagne had loosened every tongue in the room. Vivian called Damon over with a snap of her fingers, the gesture so casual it barely registered as rude to anyone but him. He walked to her without hesitation, hands folded in front of him, waiting, his expression unreadable. She opened her handbag, drew out her wallet, and pulled free a single $50 bill, holding it up for the entire hall to see, before she pressed it into his shirt pocket with a small, deliberate pat, as though she were tipping a valet rather than addressing a human being. "Go mop," she said again, her voice carrying now, deliberately theatrical, pitched for an audience. "Maybe you're better suited to conversations with a bucket than with people." The room erupted. Trevor slapped the table so hard the silverware rattled. Celeste laughed so hard she had to set down her glass before she spilled it. Somewhere near the back, a cousin lifted his phone and began recording, capturing the moment for an audience that would never see it the way they imagined, thinking only of how many laughs the video might earn among friends later that week. Damon reached up, touched the bill once, and said only, "Thank you." He turned and walked back toward the mop, his footsteps unhurried, his shoulders straight, his face betraying nothing of what he had just calculated in his head. Every person in that room believed they had just watched a man accept his own humiliation. Not one of them noticed that Damon's eyes had flicked, almost imperceptibly, to the clock mounted above the doorway. 20 minutes remained before a board meeting was set to begin 3 floors above them. A meeting none of the Hollowells had been informed about, a meeting that would determine the fate of everything they believed belonged to them. As the family returned to their champagne and their laughter, an email left Damon's phone in absolute silence. Addressed to a legal team waiting 2 floors up, 4 words long. "We proceed as planned." 3 floors above the banquet hall, a very different kind of gathering had assembled in a glass-walled conference room. One none of the celebrating relatives even knew existed within their own hospital. Attorneys sat along one side of a long table, their laptops open, documents stacked in neat, precise piles. Each folder labeled with a case number instead of a name. A row of bankers occupied the seats across from them, murmuring quietly about wire transfers and closing conditions, checking figures against figures with the practiced calm of people who moved billions of dollars, the way others moved grocery lists. On the screen at the far end of the room, a video conference link waited, 3 separate windows displaying representatives from an investment fund, whose name most of the Hollowell family had never once heard spoken aloud. Northbridge Capital. When the call connected and a new name scrolled across the screen, every attorney in the room rose to their feet without being asked. "Mr. Ashford," one of them said, nodding toward the screen with the kind of respect usually reserved for judges or generals. A respect built over years of careful, deliberate work that had nothing to do with a title, and everything to do with results. The truth those 17 relatives downstairs did not know, could not have imagined even in their wildest suspicions, was that the man they had just humiliated with a $50 bill was the chairman of Northbridge Capital, a fund that had spent the better part of 18 months quietly acquiring the parent company that owned Hollowell Memorial Hospital, moving through subsidiaries and shell entities with the patience of a man who understood that real power rarely announces itself. The paperwork had finished processing that very morning. 61% ownership, secured through a holding company so carefully structured that not even the hospital's own legal counsel had traced it back to a single name until now. Damon had insisted on one condition before the announcement went public. He wanted to walk the halls first, unnoticed, in the uniform of a man nobody important would ever bother to look at twice. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, who the Hollowell family truly was when they believed no one of consequence was watching them. Now he had his answer, recorded on a stranger's phone 2 floors below, laughter and all, evidence he had not even needed to ask for. One of the attorneys leaned toward the screen, his expression careful, professional, but unmistakably eager to move forward. "Sir," he asked, "shall we proceed with the announcement?" Damon's voice, when it came through the call, was calm, measured, entirely unlike the quiet murmur the family downstairs had grown used to dismissing without a second thought. "Not yet," he said. "Give it 1 more hour. Let them enjoy their party a little longer." There was no cruelty in the request, only a kind of patient certainty. The tone of a man who had already decided how this day would end, and saw no need to rush toward it. Downstairs, the party carried on exactly as Damon had predicted, oblivious and golden with self-satisfaction. Vivian stood near her father, glass raised, describing to a cluster of relatives the enormous investment the hospital was about to receive, an infusion of capital so significant it would secure the Hollowell family's control of the institution for another generation. Grant beamed with pride, clapping a hand on his daughter's shoulder, telling anyone who would listen that this was the proudest day of his professional life. Prouder even than the day the hospital first opened its doors. Marjorie dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Moved by sentiment, neither she, nor anyone else in the room, had earned through any real understanding of what was actually happening beneath the surface of their celebration. None of them understood the terrible irony sitting in the center of their applause. The very deal they were toasting, the very investment they believed would cement their power for another 40 years, was the exact mechanism by which they were about to lose everything they had ever called their own. Their phones had begun buzzing minutes earlier, first Trevor's, then Celeste's. Then one relative after another, screens lighting up with calls from numbers they did not recognize, and colleagues eager to reach them before the story broke publicly. Nobody answered. They assumed, in the warm haze of champagne and self-congratulation, that these were simply well-wishers calling to celebrate alongside them on such an important day for the family name. It was Grant who first noticed something was wrong. He excused himself from a conversation to glance at his own phone, frowning at 3 missed calls from the hospital's chief financial officer, a man who never called during family events unless something required urgent attention. He stepped toward a quiet corner of the room, dialed back, and listened as the voice on the other end delivered fragments of information that made no sense yet somehow made his stomach drop all the same. Something about an ownership transfer completed that morning. Something about Northbridge Capital taking a controlling position. Something about a name he could not quite place, though it nagged at him with growing unease. A name that sounded, impossibly, almost familiar. He turned slowly, scanning the room, his gaze drifting toward the doorway where, hours earlier, a quiet man in a gray uniform had disappeared with a mop and a bucket and a $50 bill folded in his pocket. An hour later, the entire executive leadership of the hospital gathered in the main boardroom on the top floor. Summoned by an urgent notice, none of them had expected on a celebration day. Vivian arrived first among the family, still flushed from champagne, still riding the confidence of a woman who believed she owned every room she entered. She pushed through the double doors, expecting to find her usual seat at the head of the table waiting for her, the seat that had belonged to her since the day her father first stepped back from daily operations. Instead, she found it occupied. Damon Ashford sat in the chairman's seat, still dressed in the gray uniform he had worn all morning. A folder of documents squared neatly in front of him. His posture calm, unbothered, as though he had sat in that exact chair 1,000 times before. For a moment Vivian simply stared. certain she had walked into the wrong meeting entirely. Some scheduling mistake her assistant would need to answer for later. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharpening with the particular irritation of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "This is a private boardroom. Someone should escort this man out immediately." She turned toward the security guard, stationed near the door, gesturing sharply, expecting the matter resolved within seconds. The way every small inconvenience in her life had always been resolved. The lead attorney rose from his chair before the guard could move, his voice cutting through the room with unmistakable authority. "I would choose your next words very carefully, Miss Sterling," he said. "That man is the new controlling owner of this hospital." The room went utterly silent. 17 relatives, filing in behind Vivian one by one, froze in the doorway as the words settled over them like a slow, spreading frost. Trevor's mouth opened and closed without sound. Celeste gripped the back of a chair as though the floor had tilted beneath her. Grant stood at the very back of the group, his face draining of color as the fragments of his earlier phone call finally clicked into place, one terrible piece at a time. Vivian's eyes moved from the attorney to Damon and back again, searching for some sign this was an elaborate joke, some mistake about to be corrected with an apology and a laugh. It found none. Damon reached into his shirt pocket, withdrew the folded $50 bill she had pressed on him that morning, and set it gently on the polished table in front of him. The small green rectangle sitting there like evidence in a trial no one had realized was already underway. He said nothing for a long moment, simply letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until every person in that room understood, without a single word spoken, exactly how far the ground had shifted beneath their feet in the span of a single morning. The lead attorney stepped forward and began projecting documents onto the wide screen mounted at the front of the boardroom, walking the assembled family through the transaction with the clinical precision lawyers reserved for moments that cannot afford ambiguity. Northbridge Capital, the screen read. 61% controlling interest, acquired through the hospital's parent holding company, absolute voting authority effective as of 9 that morning. Every signature was legitimate. Every filing had cleared every regulatory review months earlier. There was no error to find, no loophole to exploit, no argument left to make, no lawyer clever enough to unwind what had already been done. One of the younger attorneys quietly explained, for the benefit of the family members still struggling to process what they were seeing, that Northbridge Capital had been assembling its position for nearly a year and a half, moving carefully through a series of smaller acquisitions designed never to trigger the kind of regulatory attention that might alert the hospital's existing leadership before the deal was complete. Every filing had been reviewed by outside counsel twice over. Every dollar had passed through channels that would satisfy the strictest audit. There was no scandal buried in the paperwork, no shortcut taken, nothing for a family lawyer to seize upon in outrage. It had simply been done correctly, patiently, by a man none of them had ever imagined capable of orchestrating anything larger than a cleaning schedule. Grant finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than anyone had ever heard from him in 4 decades of running that hospital. "Why?" he asked, looking directly at Damon for the first time since walking into the room. "Why us? Why like this?" Damon met his gaze evenly, without malice, without triumph, only a kind of tired clarity. "I invested in a hospital," he said, "not in the egos running it." The words landed with a quiet, terrible weight, settling over Grant like something physical, something that pressed against his chest and refused to lift. He thought of 40 years spent building this institution from nothing, of long nights signing loan papers, of every sacrifice made to keep the doors open through lean years, and wondered, for the first time in a long while, whether the people he had raised to inherit it had ever truly understood what it was actually for. Vivian's composure, so carefully maintained through every difficult negotiation of her career, began to crack at the edges. Her mind raced backward through the morning, replaying moment after moment she had barely registered as significant at the time. The mop, the $50 bill, the laughter. The way he had simply said thank you and walked away without a flicker of protest, without a single word of complaint. She had mistaken his silence for weakness, She was only now beginning to understand it had been something else entirely, something closer to patience, or perhaps mercy, though she did not yet deserve either word from anyone in that room. The attorney reached for a small remote control resting beside his laptop. "Before we finalize today's transition," he said, "there is something the board should see." He pressed a button, and the wide screen at the front of the room flickered to life with a new image, unmistakably a phone camera, unmistakably the banquet hall 3 floors below, time-stamped from earlier that very morning, the resolution slightly grainy but the audio painfully clear. The video began with laughter, tinny through the small speaker but unmistakable in its cruelty. Vivian's own voice rang out across the boardroom, clear as the moment she had spoken it. "Go mop, that's what people like you get paid for." The camera panned briefly across the delighted faces of the gathered relatives before settling again on Damon. Calm, silent, accepting the bill without complaint, his dignity somehow more visible in that moment than anyone else's in the frame. No one in the boardroom spoke as the clip played to its end. No one dared to. Trevor stared at his own hands. Celeste's face had gone the color of chalk. Damon let the silence hold for a long moment after the screen went dark. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "If I were still just the man with the mop today," he asked, "would any of you have apologized?" Nobody answered. Trevor stared at the table. Celeste looked away entirely, unable to meet his eyes. Marjorie pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Her earlier tears of pride, now replaced by something closer to shame. It was Grant who finally broke, lowering his head, his shoulders curling inward with a shame that seemed to age him a decade in the space of a single breath. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that somewhere along the way, in building an empire, he had failed to teach his daughter the one lesson that mattered more than any balance sheet, more than any hospital wing named after their family. Vivian stood frozen at the center of the room, the $50 bill still resting on the table where Damon had placed it. An object that had transformed in the span of one video from a casual insult into an indictment. Her hands trembled at her sides. The confident executive who had entered that room minutes earlier now unrecognizable to the family watching her. For the first time since anyone in that family could remember, Vivian Sterling had absolutely nothing to say, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument she might have made. Before the family left the boardroom that afternoon, Damon addressed them one final time, his tone neither cold nor forgiving, simply factual, the way a surgeon might describe a diagnosis that could not be softened. He told them the transition would take effect immediately, that existing shareholder agreements would be honored according to the letter of the law, and that no one in the room would lose the small ownership percentage they had legally held before that morning. What they would lose, he explained, was influence over decisions they had never truly earned through the daily work of running an institution meant to heal people rather than flatter a family name. Trevor opened his mouth to argue, some reflexive instinct toward negotiation rising in him out of habit. But the words died before they reached his lips when he caught the look on his uncle's face. Grant simply shook his head, a small, weary motion that told his nephew more clearly than any speech could have that there was nothing left worth fighting for in that room. Celeste was the first to leave, gathering her coat without meeting anyone's eyes, moving through the hallway outside the boardroom, with the brisk pace of someone trying to outrun her own memory of the morning's laughter. One by one, the other relatives followed, 13 extended family members who had arrived that day expecting champagne and photographs, filing out in a silence far heavier than any argument might have produced between them. None of them spoke in the elevator on the way down. None of them looked at each other. The 40th anniversary banner still hung in the lobby, its gold lettering catching the afternoon light, a cheerful reminder of a celebration that had ended hours before anyone in that family realized it was truly over. The days that followed brought a wave of speculation through every level of the hospital, whispered in break rooms, murmured in hallways, debated openly among staff who had watched the Hollowell family run the institution their entire careers without ever questioning the hierarchy that governed it. Everyone assumed the new owner would move quickly and brutally, clearing out the leadership, dismantling the old guard, replacing familiar faces with strangers loyal only to Northbridge Capital and its shareholders. Damon did none of it, and the restraint itself became its own kind of statement. Instead, he called a meeting of every department head in the hospital and laid out, in plain and unadorned language, exactly what would change and exactly what would not. The medical staff, the nurses, the technicians, none of them would lose their positions simply because ownership had changed hands. What would change was the culture that had allowed a man in a gray uniform to be treated as invisible simply because of the work he did with his hands, rather than a title on a business card. New standards of conduct were drafted that same week, binding every employee regardless of rank, stating plainly that no one, not executives, not board members, not even the chief executive herself, stood above basic human respect for the people who kept the institution running through every shift, every holiday, every difficult night. Vivian was suspended within days. An internal investigation launched into patterns of conduct that had apparently gone unchecked for years. Long before Damon had ever stepped foot in that banquet hall with a mop in his hands, former employees, emboldened by the sudden shift in power at the top, began coming forward with their own stories. Small cruelties accumulated over a decade of unchecked authority that no one had ever felt safe enough to report before now. Grant sat through every hearing in silence, watching the daughter he had raised to inherit his legacy dismantle her own credibility piece by piece, and understanding with growing clarity that this reckoning had been building for years, quietly, beneath the surface of every successful quarter and every glowing headline. The internal investigation stretched across nearly a month, longer than anyone had anticipated, as human resources staff quietly interviewed employee after employee who had once worked directly beneath Vivian's leadership. A nurse who had been passed over for promotion 3 separate times, always in favor of someone with a familiar surname, finally described in detail the meeting where Vivian had told her, plainly, that certain positions were reserved for people who understood how the hospital truly worked. A phrase everyone in the room had immediately understood to mean people related to the family. A junior accountant described being forced to falsify minor expense reports to cover the cost of Vivian's personal travel. Terrified for years to refuse a request from the chief executive herself. None of these stories reached the scale of a scandal on their own, but together they painted the picture of a culture built carefully over a decade, one where fear had quietly replaced respect long before Damon ever picked up a mop in that banquet hall. Grant read every report as it came in, sitting alone in his study late at night, with a glass of water he rarely touched. The television off, the house silent around him. Marjorie found him there more than once, and though she never said much, she began sitting beside him in those quiet hours, her hand resting on his arm, the two of them absorbing together what they had failed to notice separately for years. He thought often of the day he first opened the hospital's doors, 40 years earlier, a young man with more debt than sense, and a conviction that people deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they could afford to pay for their care. He wondered when exactly that conviction had stopped extending to the people who mopped the floors of the building he built to embody it. He found Damon alone one evening in the hospital's administrative wing, still wearing the same modest clothing he always wore, reviewing reports at a desk that had once belonged to no one in particular, a desk Damon had chosen not because of what it represented but simply because it was empty and close to the floor he still liked to walk each morning. Grant stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I should have recognized you sooner," he said quietly, his voice stripped of the pride that had defined him just weeks earlier. "Not who you are on paper. What you are as a man. I built this place to serve people. Somewhere along the way, I let my own family forget that simple truth, and I never noticed until it was almost too late to fix." Damon looked up from his papers, and for the first time since the boardroom confrontation, something in his expression softened. A flicker of understanding, passing between two men who had, in their own separate ways, both lost something they could never fully get back. Vivian requested a meeting with Damon nearly 2 weeks after the suspension, arriving at his office without the confidence that had once defined every step she took through that building. Her heels no longer clicked with authority against the marble. They simply carried her forward. Quietly, uncertainly, she carried the $50 bill with her, the same one, retrieved from wherever it had been kept since the day it changed everything, and set it on his desk with hands that no longer trembled from anger, but from something closer to grief. "I want to give this back," she said. "It was never mine to give away like that. It was never mine to use as a weapon against another person's dignity." Damon did not reach for the bill. Instead, he pushed it gently back toward her across the desk. "It was always yours," he said. "What you lost was never the money." The words hung in the air between them, and Vivian felt something inside her finally break open. Not with the sharp violence of humiliation this time, but with the slow, aching clarity of genuine understanding. She thought of every employee she had overlooked, every quiet person she had dismissed, simply because their title carried less weight than her own on an organizational chart. And she understood, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, that a hospital, or any institution built to serve people, could never truly function on a foundation of contempt for the very people who made it run. Tears came before she could stop them, unfamiliar and unwelcome, after years of carefully maintained composure in every meeting, every negotiation, every public appearance. She did not try to explain herself further. There was nothing left to explain that the video and the silence and the shame had not already made clear to everyone in that building. Within the week, a formal letter of resignation arrived on the desk of the hospital's new board, written in Vivian's own hand, without a single request for severance or condition attached. A document notable, mostly for what it did not ask for. It was, perhaps, the first entirely selfless decision she had made in the whole of her professional life, and the last act of the woman she had been before that morning in the banquet hall. News of the resignation traveled through the extended family faster than any of them expected. Faster even than the original video had spread among the 17 relatives who once laughed together in that banquet hall. Trevor called Grant that same evening, his voice uncertain in a way it rarely was, asking whether there was anything left to salvage of the family's standing within the hospital's new structure. Grant told him, gently but firmly, that the only thing worth salvaging now was their own character, and that no phone call to Damon Ashford would accomplish what months of quiet decency might. Celeste stopped attending family gatherings altogether for a time, unable to sit across a table from relatives who had once laughed so easily at another person's expense, uncertain whether she had been any different from the rest of them that morning. Vivian did not disappear entirely from the hospital's story. Though her path forward looked nothing like the one she had once assumed was guaranteed to her by birth, she spent the following months in quiet, unglamorous work, volunteering hours at a community clinic across town that served patients who could rarely afford insurance, learning firsthand the parts of healthcare her executive title had always kept comfortably at a distance. She did not speak publicly about what had happened at Hollowell Memorial. She did not seek sympathy or redemption through interviews or statements. She simply worked, quietly, the way Damon once had, though it would take her considerably longer to understand that the comparison was not an accident but a kind of penance she had chosen for herself. Months later, the hospital gathered its entire staff in the main auditorium for an address none of them had expected, but many of them had quietly hoped for since the news of the transition first spread through the building. Damon stood at the podium, still dressed exactly as he had been on the day everything changed, still in the simple uniform that had once made him invisible to 17 people who should have known better than to judge a man by the tools in his hands. He looked out over rows of doctors, nurses, technicians, administrators, and support staff, every single one of them watching him now with an attention he had never once demanded, but had somehow earned entirely through months of quiet, consistent action, rather than a single dramatic speech. "I wear this uniform," he said, his voice steady and unhurried, "to remind myself of something I never want to forget. There is no job beneath dignity. There is only the way we choose to treat the people who do it. And that choice says more about our own character than it ever will about theirs." The auditorium rose to its feet in a wave of applause that lasted far longer than any formal announcement required. Doctors and janitors alike, clapping with the same genuine warmth, united for perhaps the first time in the hospital's 40-year history, by something more meaningful than a paycheck or a title on a door. Grant walked onto the stage afterward, carrying a small case in his hands, his steps slower than they had once been, but somehow steadier too. Inside rested the hospital's founding medal, a symbol reserved for the institution's original architect. A piece of history he had worn proudly at every major milestone for 4 decades of his life. He placed it gently into Damon's palm, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to hide in front of a room full of people. "This belongs with someone who actually understands what we built this place for," he said. Damon accepted it without ceremony, the way he accepted most things, with quiet gratitude rather than pride, turning the small medal over once in his fingers before slipping it into his pocket beside a $50 bill that had, by then, become something closer to a private reminder than a piece of currency. A reporter from a regional business journal did eventually track down Grant for a brief comment, hoping for some dramatic quote about betrayal or vindication. Grant offered neither. He said only that his family had learned, in the most painful way possible, that a good name built over 40 years could be undone in a single careless morning, and that the lesson had cost them more than any hospital wing was worth. He asked that the reporter print nothing further about his daughter, and the request, unusual for a man once known for courting publicity, was honored without argument. He never asked for a new office. He never requested the corner suite with the wide windows that Vivian had once occupied, the one with a view stretching clear across the city skyline. The following morning, staff arriving early for their shifts found him exactly where he had always been, moving quietly through the main hallway before the sun had fully risen, a mop in his hands, tending to the same floors he had cleaned the very first day anyone in that family had bothered to notice him at all, though for entirely different reasons than they once had. But something had changed in the way the hospital moved around him now. Something felt more than announced. Doctors who once would have walked past without a glance slowed their steps to greet him by name, some pausing to ask about his day the way they might ask a colleague rather than a stranger. Nurses coming off overnight shifts paused to say, "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," with a warmth that had nothing to do with the 61% he controlled, and everything to do with the man he had proven himself to be through every quiet, consistent choice since the day the truth came out. Administrators who had spent years chasing titles found themselves, almost without realizing it, holding doors open a little longer, speaking a little more kindly to the people whose work kept the building running long after the executives had gone home for the evening. Word of the changes at Hollowell Memorial eventually reached other hospitals across the city, other boardrooms where executives had grown just as comfortable, dismissing the people who cleaned their floors and carried their equipment and kept their buildings running through every ordinary, unremarkable day. Some dismissed the story as an unusual exception, a strange coincidence unlikely to repeat itself anywhere else. Others quietly began reviewing their own conduct, their own assumptions about which employees deserved acknowledgement and which could safely be overlooked. Damon never sought that kind of attention. He gave no interviews, issued no public statement beyond the address to his own staff, and declined every request from journalists eager to turn his story into a headline about class and humility. He preferred, he told his attorneys simply, to let the work speak for itself, the same way it always had, long before anyone in that banquet hall bothered to notice him at all. Status, it turned out, could make people bow their heads out of obligation or fear, the way 17 relatives had once bowed to a family name simply because it was printed on a hospital wing. But character, the quiet, patient, unshakable kind Damon Ashford carried through every room he entered, was the only thing that ever made them mean it. The only thing that outlasted a title, a fortune, or a single careless morning that had once seemed like nothing more than a joke among people who should have known better.